The morphine sat in a small plastic cup on the bedside table, untouched. Captain James Caldwell's hand trembled as he pushed it away for the third time that hour. His daughter, Rebecca, stood at the foot of the bed, her face streaked with tears she no longer tried to hide. The hospice nurse, a woman named Margaret with kind eyes and 2 decades of experience watching people die, leaned forward with professional patience, wearing thin. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 100 similar conversations. "The pain you're feeling, it doesn't have to be this way. This medication will help you rest. It will give you peace." James turned his head slowly toward the window. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. His breathing came in shallow, controlled bursts, the kind of breathing a man learns when he's trying not to scream. The late afternoon sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the pale blue walls of the room. Outside, the world continued as it always did. Cars passed. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Life moved forward, indifferent to the quiet battle being waged in this small room on the second floor of a modest home in suburban Virginia. "Not yet," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Rebecca stepped closer, her hands wringing together. "Dad, please! You're in so much pain. We can see it. Just take the medicine. Let yourself rest." James closed his eyes, but not in surrender. His lips moved silently, counting something only he could hear. His fingers twitched against the thin blanket covering his legs. Legs that had once carried him through rice paddies and frozen mountain passes. Legs that had run toward gunfire when every instinct screamed to run away. Now they were skeletal, motionless, failing him in ways enemy bullets never had. "Still not yet," he repeated, his voice firmer this time. Margaret exchanged a glance with Rebecca. This wasn't unusual. Denial, fear, stubbornness in the face of death. She'd seen it all. But there was something different about James Caldwell. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't in denial. He was waiting. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else. Something faint and metallic that Rebecca couldn't quite place. It reminded her of the smell of her father's old uniform, the one he kept in a garment bag in the back of his closet, the one he never wore but never threw away. She'd asked him about it once when she was 12. He'd looked at her with an expression she didn't understand then, but recognized now, the look of a man carrying something too heavy to set down. "Dad!" She tried again, her voice breaking. "What are you waiting for?" James opened his eyes and looked directly at her. For a moment, the pain seemed to recede from his face, replaced by something sharper, clearer. "I made a promise," he said. "A promise to who?" "To my men." Rebecca felt her throat tighten. Her father had never talked much about the war. She knew he'd served in Korea. She knew he'd been a captain. She knew he'd come home with medals he never displayed and nightmares he never discussed. But the details, the stories, the faces, the reasons, those had remained locked away, buried beneath decades of silence and the ordinary rhythms of civilian life. "Dad, your men, they're gone. Most of them have been gone for years." James shook his head slowly, a movement that seemed to cost him enormous effort. "Not all of them." Margaret checked her watch. It was nearly 4 o'clock. She'd been here since noon, and in that time, James Caldwell had refused medication 6 times, refused water twice, and refused to close his eyes for more than a few seconds. His vitals were declining steadily. His heart rate was erratic. His breathing was labored. By every medical measure, he should have slipped into unconsciousness hours ago. But he hadn't. He was holding on to something, or someone. "Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said gently, "is there someone you're waiting to see?" James didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted back to the door. and for the first time, Rebecca noticed how intently he was watching it, not just glancing, watching, as if he expected it to open at any moment, as if his entire existence had narrowed down to that single point of focus. "He's coming," James said finally. "Who's coming, Dad?" "Leo." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warmth of the room. "Leo? I don't know anyone named Leo." "You wouldn't," James said. His voice was growing weaker, but his resolve seemed to strengthen with every word. "I haven't seen him in 60 years, but he's coming. I know he is." Margaret stepped back, giving the family space. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the dying needed to finish something before they could let go. A conversation, a reconciliation, a goodbye. It wasn't her place to rush them, no matter how much pain they were in. But watching James Caldwell suffer, watching him choose to suffer, was one of the hardest things she'd witnessed in her career. Rebecca pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, taking her father's hand. It was cold and papery, the skin loose over prominent bones. She remembered these hands teaching her to ride a bike, to tie her shoes, to drive a car. Strong hands, steady hands. Now they trembled with exhaustion and pain. "Tell me about Leo," she said softly. James's eyes flickered with something that might have been gratitude. He took a shallow breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "We were in the same unit. Korea. Winter of 1950. Coldest damn winter I've ever known. Cold that gets into your bones and never leaves. We were part of a platoon. 23 men when we started. Good men, young men. Most of them had never been away from home before." He paused, his breathing labored. Rebecca wanted to tell him to stop, to rest, but she sensed that talking was somehow keeping him anchored, keeping him present. "We got separated from the main force during the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir, cut off, surrounded. We held a position in the mountains for 11 days. 11 days with no resupply, no reinforcements, temperatures dropping to 30 below zero. Men started dying, not from bullets, from the cold, from hunger, from giving up." Rebecca squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to." "I do," James interrupted. "I need you to understand. On the 10th night, we were down to 7 men, 7 out of 23. We knew we probably weren't going to make it out, so we made a pact. All 7 of us. We swore that whoever survived, whoever made it home, would live for all of us, carry the memory, tell the stories, and we swore something else." He turned his head to look directly at Rebecca, and she saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "We swore that the last man standing would be there when the others passed, that none of us would die alone, that the last one would close the circle." The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the oxygen concentrator in the corner. Rebecca felt the weight of her father's words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She'd known her father was a veteran. She'd known he'd served with honor. But she'd never known this. Never known about the 7 men, the pact, the promise that had apparently shaped the rest of his life. "How many are left?" she asked quietly. 2, James said. "Me and Leo. And you're waiting for him." "I'm the captain," James said, and for a moment, his voice carried an echo of the authority he must have wielded decades ago. "I go last. That was the deal. I closed the circle." Margaret, who had been standing quietly near the window, spoke up. "Mr. Caldwell, has anyone contacted this Leo? Does he know you're here?" James nodded weakly. "My son, Michael. He tracked Leo down 3 days ago. Called him. Leo said he was coming. He lives in Montana now. Said he'd catch the first flight he could." Rebecca felt a surge of emotion, frustration, sadness, and something else she couldn't quite name. Her brother Michael had known about this and hadn't told her. But then again, Michael had always been closer to their father's military past. He'd joined the army himself, served 2 tours in Iraq. He understood things about their father that Rebecca never could. "When did Michael call him?" Rebecca asked. "Tuesday morning." Today was Thursday. Rebecca's mind raced. Montana to Virginia. Even with connections, that was a full day of travel at least. And Leo was old. He had to be. If he'd served with her father in Korea, he'd be in his 90s now. Could he even travel? Was it realistic to expect him to make it here in time? As if reading her thoughts, James spoke again. "He'll make it. Leo never broke a promise in his life. Not once." The afternoon stretched into evening. The sun sank lower, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. Rebecca's husband Tom arrived with dinner that no one ate. Her brother Michael called twice, his voice tight with worry, saying he was stuck in traffic coming back from the airport where he'd gone to wait for Leo's flight. The plane had been delayed, then delayed again. Leo was somewhere over the Midwest, fighting weather and fate to keep a promise made 74 years ago. James refused the morphine again and again. Each time, the refusal seemed to cost him more. His body was shutting down, systems failing one by one, but his will remained unbroken. Margaret monitored his vitals with increasing concern. His blood pressure was dropping. His oxygen saturation was declining. He was, by every medical definition, dying, but he wouldn't let go. "Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said around 7 o'clock, her professional composure finally cracking slightly. "I need you to understand something. The pain you're experiencing, it's only going to get worse. Your body is failing. If you don't take something soon, the pain will become unbearable. You could suffer tremendously in your final hours." James turned his head toward her, and despite the agony etched into every line of his face, he smiled, a small, sad smile that carried the weight of a lifetime. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper now, "I've been cold and hungry and shot at. I've watched good men die in my arms. I've carried bodies through snow so deep I thought I'd never see the ground again. I've lived 74 years with the faces of 19 dead boys in my head. I think I can handle a few more hours of pain if it means keeping my word." Margaret had no response to that. She simply nodded and stepped back, humbled by a kind of courage she'd never encountered before. Night fell. The room grew darker, illuminated only by a small lamp on the dresser and the glow of medical monitors. Rebecca dozed fitfully in the chair beside the bed, jerking awake every time her father made a sound. Tom sat on the small sofa against the wall, his head in his hands. Margaret remained vigilant, checking vitals, adjusting pillows, offering comfort where she could. James drifted in and out of consciousness, but every time his eyes opened, they went immediately to the door, waiting, watching, hoping. At 9:47 p.m., his breathing changed. It became shallower, more irregular. Margaret recognized the pattern immediately, the body's final preparations for shutdown. She moved quickly to the bedside, checking his pulse. It was thready and weak. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "you should call your brother. Tell him to hurry." Rebecca fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. She dialed Michael's number. He answered on the first ring. "Becca! Michael, where are you?" He's getting worse. I don't know how much longer." "We're 20 minutes out," Michael said, his voice strained. "Maybe less. Leo's flight finally landed. We're on the highway now. Just tell Dad to hold on. Please, tell him Leo's almost there." Rebecca looked at her father. His eyes were closed now, his breathing labored and irregular. She leaned close to his ear. "Dad," she whispered, "Michael's on his way. He has Leo with him. They're almost here. 20 minutes. Can you hear me? They're almost here." For a long moment, James didn't respond. Then slowly, His lips moved. Rebecca had to lean even closer to hear the words. 20 minutes, he repeated. I can do 20 minutes. But his body was betraying him. His breathing became more erratic. His skin took on a greyish pallor. Margaret checked the monitors and saw what she'd been dreading. His vitals were crashing. He had minutes, not 20. Maybe less. Mr. Caldwell, Margaret said urgently, please, let me give you something for the pain. Just something to ease. No, James said, the word coming out with surprising force. He's coming. I wait. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. Dad, please, you don't have to do this. You don't have to suffer like this. James opened his eyes one more time and looked at his daughter with a clarity that seemed impossible, given his condition. Yes, he said simply. I do. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Each breath James took seemed like it might be his last. His hand, still clasped in Rebecca's, grew colder. His pulse weakened further. Margaret prepared herself for the inevitable, positioning herself to provide comfort to the family when the moment came. 10:03 p.m. James's breathing stopped for 5 full seconds. Rebecca gasped, thinking it was over. Then he drew in another ragged breath, his chest rising with visible effort. 10:07 p.m. His eyes rolled back slightly. His grip on Rebecca's hand loosened. Margaret checked for a pulse and found it barely perceptible. 10:11 p.m. Rebecca's phone buzzed. A text from Michael. 5 minutes. Hold on, Dad. 5 minutes. Rebecca read the message aloud, her voice breaking. Dad, did you hear that? 5 minutes. Just 5 more minutes. You can do this. James's lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes remained fixed on the door, though Rebecca wasn't sure if he could actually see it anymore. His body was failing, shutting down system by system, but something, some core of will that defied medical explanation, kept him tethered to consciousness. 10:14 p.m. The sound of a car in the driveway, doors slamming, hurried footsteps on the front walk. Rebecca stood up, her heart pounding. That's them! Dad, that's them! They're here! The front door opened downstairs. She could hear Michael's voice, urgent and loud. Where is he? Is he still? Up here, Rebecca called out. Hurry! Footsteps on the stairs, fast, then slower. Michael appeared in the doorway first, his face flushed and anxious. Behind him, moving with painstaking slowness, came a man in a wheelchair pushed by a young woman, probably a caretaker or family member. The man in the wheelchair was ancient. His face was a landscape of wrinkles, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his body bent with the weight of 9 decades. But his eyes were sharp and clear and filled with an urgency that transcended his physical limitations. James, the old man said, his voice cracking with emotion. James, I'm here. Rebecca stepped back from the bed, making room. The young woman pushed the wheelchair closer, positioning it right beside the bed. The old man, Leo, reached out with a trembling hand and grasped James's. James's eyes, which had been glazed and unfocused, suddenly sharpened. His head turned slowly toward the sound of Leo's voice. When he saw his old friend, something changed in his face. The pain didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. Relief, recognition, peace. Leo, James whispered, the name barely audible. I'm here, Captain, Leo said, tears streaming down his weathered face. I'm sorry I'm late. Traffic was hell and the damn plane. But I'm here now. I made it. James's lips curved into the faintest smile. You always were terrible with time. Leo laughed, a sound caught between joy and grief. Yeah, well, some things never change. For a moment, the 2 old men simply looked at each other, their hands clasped, and in that look passed 74 years of shared history. Battles fought, brothers lost, promises made and kept. A lifetime of carrying the weight of survival. The others? James asked, his voice so weak now that Leo had to lean forward to hear. All accounted for, Leo said firmly. Every single one. I was there for Mitchell in 03, for Rodriguez in 09, for Chen in 15, for Patterson in 18, for Kowalski last year. I kept the count, James. I kept the promise. And now, his voice broke. Now it's just us. The last two. James closed his eyes, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. Good, he whispered. Good. They didn't die alone. None of them, Leo confirmed. And neither will you. Rebecca stood frozen, watching this exchange with a sense of awe she couldn't fully articulate. This was what her father had been waiting for. Not just to see an old friend, not just to say goodbye, but to complete something that had begun in the frozen mountains of Korea 74 years ago, to fulfill a promise that had defined his entire life. Margaret, standing quietly in the corner, wiped tears from her own eyes. In 20 years of hospice work, she'd never witnessed anything like this. Michael moved to stand beside his sister, putting an arm around her shoulders. I didn't know if we'd make it in time, he said quietly. Leo's flight was delayed twice. Then there was traffic. I was driving 90 miles an hour on the highway. I thought we'd be too late. He wouldn't let himself go, Rebecca said. He just wouldn't. Leo was speaking again, his voice low and gentle. James, listen to me. You've carried us for so long. All of us. You've held the line. You've kept the faith. But it's time now. It's time to let go. James shook his head slightly, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. Can't, he breathed. I'm the captain. I go last. You are going last, Leo said firmly. James, look at me. James opened his eyes. I'm 93 years old, Leo said. I've got cancer in my lungs and my bones. The doctors give me maybe 3 months, probably less. You're not leaving me behind, brother. You're just going first by a little bit. I'll be right behind you, I promise. Unchi, James stared at his old friend, processing these words. You promise? On my life, Leo said. On the memory of every man we lost. I promise. You can go, James. The count is complete. The circle is closed. You've done your duty. You've honored every one of them. Now it's time to rest. CTA number 1. Inserted at moment of high tension. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. James's breathing, which had been shallow and labored, seemed to ease slightly. His grip on Leo's hand tightened for just a moment, then relaxed. The count is complete. The count is complete, Captain, Leo said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. All present and accounted for. You can stand down now. You've earned your rest. For the first time in days, maybe in years, maybe in decades, James Caldwell's face relaxed. The lines of pain and determination that had been carved so deeply into his features softened. His eyes, which had been locked on the door for hours, finally closed. Tell them, he whispered. Leo leaned closer. Tell who, James? Tell them. I kept my word. They know, Leo said, his voice breaking. They've always known. Every one of them knows. You were the best captain any of us could have asked for. You brought us home when no one else could. You carried us when we couldn't walk. You've honored us every day of your life. They know, James. They all know. James took a breath, deeper than any he'd taken in hours. Then he exhaled slowly, and with that breath, something fundamental changed. The tension that had been holding him together, that had kept him conscious and fighting against the inevitable, finally released. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for coming. Nowhere else I'd be, Leo said. Nowhere else in the world. James's lips moved one more time, forming words that might have been names: Mitchell, Rodriguez, Chen, Patterson, Kowalski, the brothers he'd carried with him for 74 years, the men who had never really left him, who had walked beside him through every day of his long life. And then, with Leo's hand in his, and his family surrounding him, Captain James Caldwell finally allowed himself to let go. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat, which had been fighting so hard for so long, began to quiet. Margaret watched the monitors, seeing the inevitable progression, but she didn't intervene. This was how it was supposed to be. This was what James had been waiting for. Rebecca moved to the other side of the bed, taking her father's other hand. Michael stood at the foot, his hand on his father's leg. Tom stood behind Rebecca, his hands on her shoulders. The young woman who had brought Leo, his granddaughter it turned out, stood quietly by the door, bearing witness to something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Dad," Rebecca said softly, "we love you. We love you so much." James didn't respond, but his face remained peaceful. The pain that had twisted his features for days was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like contentment. Leo was still talking, his voice low and steady, speaking words meant only for his captain, his brother, his friend. "We'll be waiting for you, James. All of us. When it's my turn, I'll see you again. We'll have that drink we always talked about. We'll tell the stories. We'll remember the cold and the fear and the way we held the line when everyone said we couldn't. We'll remember, brother. We'll always remember." At 10:34 p.m. on a Thursday evening in suburban Virginia, surrounded by family and the last surviving member of his platoon, Captain James Caldwell took his final breath. It was quiet, peaceful, nothing like the violent, chaotic deaths he'd witnessed in Korea. Nothing like the end he'd probably imagined for himself during those 11 days in the frozen mountains. He simply stopped, and in stopping, he completed something that had begun 74 years earlier in a desperate promise made by 7 young men who thought they were going to die. The room fell silent. Margaret stepped forward and checked for a pulse, a formality at this point. She looked at the clock, noting the time, then gently closed James's eyes. "He's gone," she said softly. Rebecca collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing. Michael stood frozen, his jaw clenched, fighting to maintain composure. Leo sat in his wheelchair, still holding James's hand, tears streaming down his face. "Rest easy, Captain," Leo whispered. "Your watch is over." Leo remained at James's bedside for nearly an hour after the captain's death, his weathered hand still resting on his old friend's arm. The room had grown quiet except for the soft sounds of grief. Rebecca's muffled crying, the rustle of tissues, whispered condolences from Margaret as she completed her final duties with practiced gentleness. The monitors had been silenced, their screens dark, no longer tracking a heartbeat that had finally been allowed to stop. Michael stood by the window, his back to the room, shoulders rigid with the kind of controlled emotion that military training had taught him to contain. He'd seen death before. In Iraq, he'd seen plenty of it. But this was different. This was his father. This was the man who had taught him what duty meant, what honor required, what promises were worth keeping, even when keeping them cost everything. Leo's granddaughter, whose name was Sarah, stood quietly near the door, giving the family space, but remaining close enough to help her grandfather when he was ready to leave. She was 32, a nurse practitioner in Billings, Montana, and she'd taken 3 days off work to accompany her grandfather on this journey. She hadn't understood why it was so important to him, why he'd insisted on traveling despite his deteriorating health, despite his doctor's warnings, despite the obvious risks. Now, watching him sit vigil over his fallen captain, she understood completely. "Grandpa," she said gently after some time had passed, We should probably let the family have some privacy, and you need to rest. It's been a long day." Leo didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on James's face, peaceful now in death, free from the pain that had ravaged it in those final hours. "Just a few more minutes," he said quietly. I need to say goodbye, properly." Rebecca, who had composed herself somewhat, looked up from where she sat beside the bed. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face blotchy with tears, but there was something else in her expression now. Curiosity, perhaps, or a need to understand the bond that had driven her father to endure such suffering. "Mr. Leo," she said, her voice hoarse, would you tell me about them? About the others? About the promise?" Leo turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw depths of memory and loss that made her own grief feel suddenly small by comparison. "You want to know about the 7? He asked. "I want to know why my father chose to die in agony rather than break a promise to men I've never heard of," Rebecca said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only a desperate need to make sense of what she'd just witnessed. Leo nodded slowly. "Then you should know their names. You should know who they were, because your father carried them with him every day of his life, and they deserve to be carried." He shifted in his wheelchair, wincing slightly as his cancer-riddled bones protested the movement. Sarah moved forward to help him, but he waved her off. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just old." He looked back at Rebecca. "There were 7 of us who made it out of those mountains. 7 out of 23. Your father was our captain. He was 24 years old, and he kept us alive when we had no right to be alive." Margaret had finished her duties and was preparing to leave, but she paused, drawn by Leo's words. Michael turned from the window. Tom stopped his quiet pacing. Everyone in the room seemed to recognize that something important was happening, that Leo was about to share something that had been locked away for decades. The first was Private First Class David Mitchell, Leo began, his voice taking on the cadence of a man who had told this story before, probably to himself, in the quiet hours of countless nights. He was from Ohio, 19 years old. He'd been a high school football star, had a scholarship to Ohio State waiting for him after his service. He took a bullet in the shoulder during the fighting, but he survived. He made it home. He married his high school sweetheart, had 4 kids, worked at a steel mill for 40 years. He died in 2003, heart attack, quick and painless. Your father flew to Cleveland for the funeral. I met him there. We hadn't seen each other in 53 years, but when we saw each other across that cemetery, it was like no time had passed at all. Rebecca listened, transfixed. Her father had gone to Cleveland in 2003. She remembered because it had been right after her son was born, and her father had missed meeting his first grandchild for 3 days because of that trip. He'd never explained where he'd gone or why. Now she knew. The second was Corporal Miguel Rodriguez, Leo continued. From Texas. He was our medic. He kept us alive in those mountains, patching wounds with strips of cloth torn from dead men's uniforms, rationing morphine that we didn't have enough of, staying awake for days at a time to watch over the wounded. He came home and became a doctor, spent his whole career working in free clinics in poor neighborhoods. He died in 2009 stroke. Your father and I were both there. We held his hands when he went. We told him that every life he'd saved as a doctor was built on the foundation of the lives he'd saved in Korea. He smiled when we said that. Then he was gone. Michael had moved closer now, drawn into the story despite himself. Dad never mentioned any of this, he said quietly. Not once. Your father didn't talk about the war, Leo said. None of us did, really. How do you explain something like that to people who weren't there? How do you tell them what it was like to be so cold that you couldn't feel your fingers? so hungry that you thought about eating leather, so scared that you pissed yourself and didn't even care because everyone else was doing the same thing. You don't. You can't. So you carry it quietly, and you find the others who carry it too, and you hold each other up from a distance." He paused. Gathering strength, Sarah offered him water, and he took a small sip before continuing. The third was Private First Class Tommy Chen. His parents had immigrated from China, and he'd grown up in San Francisco. He was the youngest of us, just 18. He could speak a little Chinese, and sometimes the enemy would shout things at us in Chinese, trying to get us to surrender. Tommy would shout back, telling them things I won't repeat in polite company. He made us laugh even when we were dying. He came home and opened a restaurant in Chinatown, best dim sum in the city. He died in 2015 lung cancer. He'd never smoked a day in his life, but breathing in all that smoke from burning buildings and vehicles in Korea, the doctors said that's probably what did it. Your father and I were there. We ate dim sum in his hospital room, and we told stories until he couldn't laugh anymore. Then we held his hands, and we told him it was okay to go, that we'd remember the laughter. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face again, but they were different now. These weren't just tears of grief for her father. They were tears for men she'd never known, men whose names she'd never heard until tonight, men who had shaped her father's life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The fourth was Sergeant William Patterson, Leo said, from Georgia. He was your father's second in command, the one who kept the men organized when your father was out scouting or negotiating with command over the radio. He was tough as nails, mean as a snake when he needed to be, but he loved those men like they were his own brothers. He came home and became a teacher, high school history. He wanted kids to understand what war really was, not the glorified version they saw in movies. He died in 2018, Alzheimer's. That was hard. By the end, he didn't remember Korea. He didn't remember the cold, or the fear, or the promise. But your father and I remembered for him. We sat with him in his nursing home, and we told him stories about himself until he fell asleep. He never woke up. The room had grown very still. Even the sounds from outside, the distant traffic, the wind in the trees, seemed to have faded away, as if the world itself was listening to Leo's testimony. The fifth was Private First Class Stanley Kowalski, Leo continued, and his voice cracked slightly on the name. From Chicago, Polish family, big and loud and full of love. Stanley played the harmonica. Can you believe that? In the middle of a war, in the middle of winter, with death all around us, Stanley would pull out his harmonica and play. Nothing fancy, just simple songs. You Are My Sunshine, Home on the Range, things that reminded us we were human. He came home and worked in his family's bakery. Never married, never had kids, but he treated every customer like family. He died last year, just last October. Pneumonia. Your father couldn't travel by then. He was already too sick. But we set up a video call, and your father was there on a screen next to Stanley's bed. They talked about the harmonica. Stanley said he still had it, that he'd played it just the week before. Your father told him to play You Are My Sunshine one more time. Stanley tried, but he was too weak. So your father sang it instead, his voice coming through that little speaker, and Stanley closed his eyes and smiled. He died 2 hours later. Michael had tears running down his face now, not bothering to hide them. Jesus, he whispered. All this time, all these years, and Dad never said a word. He didn't need to say anything, Leo replied. He lived it. Every day of his life, he lived it. He honored those men by being the best man he could be, by being a good father, a good husband, a good citizen. by keeping his word, no matter what it cost him. Rebecca's mind was reeling. She was thinking about all the times her father had seemed distant, distracted, lost in thoughts he never shared. She'd always assumed he was just quiet by nature, reserved in the way that men of his generation often were. Now she understood that he'd been carrying an entire platoon of ghosts, keeping them alive through memory and honor and an unbreakable promise. "And the sixth?" she asked quietly. Leo smiled, though it was a sad smile. "The sixth was me, Private Leo James Morrison, from a little town in Montana you've never heard of. I was a farm kid, didn't know anything about the world beyond my family's ranch. The army taught me real quick. Korea taught me even faster. I was a rifleman, nothing special, just another grunt trying to stay alive. But your father, Captain Caldwell, he made me feel like I mattered, like my life had value beyond just being another body with a gun. He saved my life at least 3 times that I can count, probably more that I don't know about. When we made that promise in the mountains, when we swore we'd be there for each other, I knew I'd keep it no matter what, and I have. I've been there for every one of them, and now—" His voice trailed off. He looked down at James's still form, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs. "Now, there's just me," he finished. "The last one. The end of the line." Sarah moved to her grandfather's side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Grandpa," she said softly, "you should rest. You've done what you came to do. You kept your promise." "Not yet," Leo said, echoing the words James had spoken for hours. "There's one more thing." He reached into the pocket of his jacket, an old military-style field jacket that looked like it had seen decades of use, and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing 7 dog tags on a single chain. They clinked together softly, a sound like wind chimes made of memory and metal. "When we made the pact," Leo explained, "we each took one of our dog tags off and put them together on a chain. The idea was that the last man standing would carry all of them, would keep them together until the end. I've been carrying 6 of them for years now. Every time one of the brothers passed, I added his tag to the chain. And now," he carefully removed one of the tags from the chain, James's tag, marked with his name, rank, and service number. He held it up, the metal catching the soft light from the bedside lamp. "Now I add the captain's tag to the chain," Leo said, "and I carry all 7 until it's my turn." He leaned forward in his wheelchair, reaching out to place the chain with 6 tags around James's neck, leaving it to rest on his chest. Then he took the single tag, James's tag, and added it to his own chain, which he wore around his neck. "7 men made a promise," Leo said, his voice steady now, despite the tears on his face. 7 men swore they'd never let each other die alone, and we didn't. Not one of us. From 1950 to 2024, 74 years, we kept that promise, every single one of us. He reached out and placed his hand on James's chest, over the chain of dog tags. "Rest easy, Captain. Your men are waiting for you. Tell them I'll be along soon. Tell them the circle is closed. Tell them we kept the faith." CTA 2. Inserted at moment of maximum emotion. If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. Rebecca stood and moved around the bed. She knelt beside Leo's wheelchair, looking up at this ancient warrior who had traveled across the country to keep a promise made before she was born. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for helping him let go, for giving him permission to rest." Leo looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw a kindness that had survived decades of hardship and loss. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew," he said, not because he wasn't afraid. We were all afraid, but because he led us anyway, because he put our lives before his own every single time, because he carried the weight of command like it was a sacred trust, and he never put it down, not for 74 years, not until tonight. Why didn't he tell us? Rebecca asked. Why didn't he share this with his family? Leo considered the question carefully. Because some burdens are too heavy to share, he said finally. Because he didn't want you to carry what he carried. Because he loved you enough to bear it alone. And because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because the men who don't talk about war are often the ones who saw the worst of it. Your father saw things no man should see. He did things no man should have to do. He made choices that saved lives, but cost him pieces of his soul. He came home, and he built a good life, a normal life, because that's what his men would have wanted for him. But he never forgot them. He never stopped being their captain. Michael had moved closer now, standing beside his sister. Did he ever talk to you about it? He asked Leo. About what happened in those mountains? Once, Leo said. Just once. It was at Mitchell's funeral in 2003. After everyone else had left, your father and I stood by the grave, and he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, Leo, I've spent 53 years wondering if I made the right calls up there. If I could have saved more of them. If I could have done something different. And I told him what I'll tell you now. Your father made impossible decisions in impossible circumstances, and he brought 7 men home when no one expected any of us to survive. He was 24 years old, and he carried the weight of 23 lives on his shoulders. Some of those lives were lost, but 7 were saved. And those 7 men went on to live full lives, to have families, to make differences in their communities, to matter. That's your father's legacy. Not the ones he lost, but the ones he saved. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth and grief, and a kind of redemption. Rebecca felt something shifting inside her, a reframing of her entire understanding of who her father had been. She'd known him as a quiet man, a steady presence, someone who showed love through actions rather than words. Now she understood that his quietness had been full of voices. The voices of 19 men who had died in the cold, and 6 men who had lived because of his leadership. What happened to his tag? Michael asked, pointing to the chain Leo wore. You said you carry all 7, but you only put 6 around Dad's neck. Leo touched the chain around his own neck, feeling the weight of the 7 tags. The last tag stays with me, he said. When I die, my granddaughter Sarah has instructions. She's going to take all 7 tags and have them buried together in a special plot at Arlington National Cemetery, a memorial for the 7. So even in death, we'll be together, the way we promised. Sarah nodded, confirming this. It's all arranged, she said quietly. Grandpa set it up years ago. He's already paid for everything. When the time comes, the 7 tags will be interred together with a plaque listing all 7 names and the words, "They kept the faith." Rebecca felt a chill run through her. The level of planning, the depth of commitment, the sheer weight of this promise, it was almost overwhelming. How long do you have? She asked Leo, remembering what he'd told her father about his cancer. The doctors say 3 months, Leo replied. Maybe 4 if I'm lucky. The cancer's in my lungs and bones. It's aggressive. I've declined treatment. At 93, I figure I've had a good run. And besides, he looked down at James again. Besides, I've got a promise to keep. I need to join my brothers. I've made them wait long enough. You're not afraid? Michael asked. Leo smiled, and it was a genuine smile, free from fear or regret. Son, I've been ready to die since 1950. Every day since then has been borrowed time. Every sunrise I've seen, every meal I've eaten, every moment of joy or sorrow or simple existence. It's all been a gift, because I should have died in those mountains. We all should have, but we didn't. Your father made sure we didn't. So no, I'm not afraid. I'm grateful, and I'm ready to see my brothers again." The room fell silent once more. Margaret, who had been waiting quietly to complete her final paperwork, stepped forward. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said gently, "but I do need to make some arrangements. The funeral home will need to be contacted, and there are forms that need to be signed." Rebecca nodded, pulling herself together. "Of course, I'll take care of that." As Margaret began explaining the next steps, Leo remained by James's bedside, his hand still resting on his old captain's arm. Sarah stood beside him, patient and supportive, understanding that her grandfather needed this time. After the immediate logistics were handled and Margaret had stepped out to make phone calls, Rebecca returned to Leo. "Will you come to the funeral?" she asked. "I know it's a lot to ask, given your health, but I think Dad would want you there." "I'll be there," Leo said without hesitation. "I've been to 6 funerals for my brothers. I'm not missing the captain's." "We'll arrange everything," Michael added. "Transportation, accommodation, whatever you need. Your family, you and Sarah both." Leo looked up at Michael, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of shared military service, of understanding what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. "Your father would be proud of you," Leo said. "Both of you. He talked about you, you know, in our phone calls over the years. He never said much, but I could hear the pride in his voice, the love." "You talked regularly?" Rebecca asked, surprised. "Once a year," Leo confirmed, "on November 27th, the day we made the pact. Every year for 74 years, we'd call each other. Sometimes we'd talk for hours, sometimes just a few minutes. But we always made contact. We always remembered." November 27th. Rebecca's mind raced back through years of memories. Had her father always been different on that date? Had there been a pattern she'd missed? She thought about it and realized that yes, there had been something. Her father had always been quieter on that day, more reflective. He'd often taken a walk alone in the evening, regardless of weather. She'd never thought to ask why. "There's so much I didn't know about him," she said softly. "So much he never shared." "He shared what mattered," Leo replied. "He shared his love, his time, his presence. The rest, the war, the memories, the ghosts, those were his to carry. And he carried them with honor." Tom, who had been quiet throughout most of this, spoke up. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something? Why was it so important that you all be there when each man died? I understand the promise, but why that specific promise?" Leo turned to look at Tom, considering the question. "Because we'd seen too many men die alone," he said finally. "In the cold, in the dark, calling out for mothers or wives or God, with no one to hold their hand or tell them it was okay. We'd seen men take their last breath with nothing but fear and loneliness in their eyes. And we swore, all 7 of us swore, that we would never let that happen to each other, that when our time came, we'd have a brother there, someone who understood, someone who remembered, someone who could tell us it was okay to go, that we'd done our duty, that we'd lived with honor, because that's what soldiers need at the end. Not prayers or platitudes, but recognition from someone who was there, someone who knows." The simplicity and profundity of the answer left everyone quiet. It made perfect sense, and yet it was almost incomprehensible in its commitment. To maintain that promise across 74 years, across thousands of miles, through all the changes and challenges of life, it spoke to a bond that most people would never experience or understand. "Your father understood that better than anyone," Leo continued, "because he was the one who had to write the letters to the families of the 19 men who didn't make it out. He was the one who had to find the words to explain why someone's son or husband or brother wasn't coming home. He was 24 years old, and he had to do that 19 times. It nearly broke him. So when we made our pact, when we promised we'd be there for each other, he made me promise something else too. What was that? Rebecca asked. He made me promise that if he died first, I'd tell his family what those 11 days were really like. Not the sanitized version, not the hero story, but the truth, the fear and the cold and the impossible choices. Because he wanted you to understand that he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who did his best in the worst circumstances imaginable, and his best was enough to save 7 lives. Leo looked directly at Rebecca and Michael. So, I'm keeping that promise now. Your father was terrified in those mountains. He cried at night when he thought no one could hear. He prayed to a God he wasn't sure believed in him. He made decisions that haunted him for the rest of his life. He wasn't fearless. He wasn't invincible. He was human. But he led anyway. He carried us anyway. He brought us home anyway. And that's what makes him a hero. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of duty in spite of fear. Michael wiped his eyes, not bothering to hide his tears anymore. Thank you, he said. Thank you for telling us that, for helping us understand. It's what he wanted, Leo said simply. And I always do what the captain wants. The hours passed slowly. The funeral home arrived around midnight to take James's body. Rebecca and Michael made the necessary arrangements, signed the necessary papers, went through the mechanical motions of death's bureaucracy. Leo remained in the room until the very end, until James's body was carefully transferred to the gurney and covered with a sheet. As they wheeled James out, Leo stood, with great difficulty and Sarah's help, and came to attention, rendering a salute that his 93-year-old body could barely manage, but his spirit demanded. He held the salute until James had been taken from the room, until the sound of the gurney's wheels had faded down the stairs and out the front door. Then he sat back down in his wheelchair, exhausted, and allowed Sarah to take him to the guest room that Rebecca had quickly prepared. But before he left, he turned back to Rebecca one more time. "Your father's last words," he said. "Do you remember what they were?" Rebecca thought back through the blur of those final moments. He said, "Thank you for coming." Leo shook his head gently. Those were his last words to me, but his very last words. The ones he whispered right at the end. "Do you remember?" Rebecca tried to recall, but the memory was fragmented, overwhelmed by emotion. I'm not sure." "He said names," Leo told her. "Mitchell, Rodriguez, Chen, Patterson, Kowalski." He was calling the roll, making sure everyone was accounted for, being the captain until his very last breath. That's who your father was. That's who he'll always be. With that, Leo allowed Sarah to wheel him from the room, leaving Rebecca and Michael and Tom standing in the sudden emptiness, surrounded by the lingering presence of something profound and sacred. Rebecca walked to the window and looked out at the night. Somewhere out there, in cemeteries and memorial gardens across the country, 6 men lay at rest, their promises kept, their duties fulfilled, and now her father had joined them, the 7th and final member of a brotherhood forged in fire and ice and impossible odds. "He never told us," she said again, but this time there was no confusion in her voice, only understanding. "He never told us because he didn't need to. He showed us every day, the way he lived, the way he loved, the way he kept his word, no matter what it cost." Michael came to stand beside her. "I'm going to tell his story," he said quietly. "At the funeral, I'm going to tell everyone about the 7, about the promise, about what it meant." "He'd like that," Rebecca agreed. "He'd want people to know, not for glory, but for memory, so the others aren't forgotten. And they stood together in silence, brother and sister, children of a man they were only now beginning to truly understand. Outside, the world continued its indifferent rotation, but in this small room in suburban Virginia, something had ended and something had begun. A promise kept, a circle closed, a legacy revealed. The funeral was held 4 days later at a small church in Alexandria. Rebecca had expected a modest gathering. Her father had been a quiet man, not one for large social circles. But when the day came, the church was packed. There were neighbors and former co-workers, members of the VFW post her father had belonged to but rarely attended, distant relatives who had driven hours to pay their respects. And there, in the front row, sat Leo Morrison in his wheelchair, wearing his old army dress uniform that hung loose on his diminished frame, but still carried an unmistakable dignity. Sarah sat beside him, and next to her were 3 other elderly individuals, 2 men and a woman, who had travelled from different parts of the country. Rebecca approached them before the service began. "Thank you for coming," she said to Leo. "Wouldn't miss it," Leo replied. Then he gestured to the others. "These are the families. David Mitchell's daughter, Susan. Miguel Rodriguez's son, Carlos. Tommy Chen's grandson, David. They wanted to be here, to represent the brothers." Rebecca felt tears welling up again. That's beautiful, thank you." Susan Mitchell, a woman in her 60s with her father's kind eyes, took Rebecca's hand. "Your father saved my dad's life," she said. "I wouldn't exist if it weren't for Captain Caldwell. None of us would. We're here to honor that." The service was simple, but powerful. The pastor, who had met with Rebecca and Michael several times to prepare, spoke about duty and sacrifice and the quiet heroism of ordinary men. He spoke about promises kept and burdens carried, and love expressed through action rather than words. Then Michael stood to give the eulogy. He'd written and rewritten it a dozen times, trying to find the right words. In the end, he'd decided to simply tell the truth. "My father was a quiet man," he began. "Growing up, I sometimes thought he was distant, reserved, hard to know. It wasn't until this week, until the night he died, that I understood why. My father wasn't distant. He was full of memories and responsibilities and promises that he carried every single day of his life." He told the story then, all of it. The 23 men who went into the mountains, the 11 days of cold and fear and impossible odds, the 19 who didn't come home, the 7 who did, and the promise they made to each other. He told them about David Mitchell and Miguel Rodriguez and Tommy Chen and William Patterson and Stanley Kowalski and Leo Morrison. He told them about 74 years of phone calls and funerals and a promise kept across decades and distances. "My father died in pain," Michael said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "He refused medication for hours because he was waiting for his brother Leo to arrive. He endured agony because he had given his word 74 years ago that he would be there for his men and they would be there for him. And when Leo finally arrived, when he told my father that it was okay to let go, my father finally allowed himself to rest. Because the promise was kept. The circle was closed. The duty was fulfilled." He paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. "My father taught me a lot of things. How to throw a baseball, how to change a tire, how to treat people with respect. But the greatest lesson he taught me, I didn't learn until the night he died. He taught me that your word is everything, that the promises you make define who you are, that honor isn't about glory or recognition. It's about doing what you said you'd do, even when it costs you everything." When Michael finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Even the pastor had to pause to compose himself before continuing with the service. At the graveside, as James's casket was lowered into the ground, Leo stood again with Sarah's help. He pulled out the chain of 7 dog tags and held it up, letting it catch the sunlight. "Captain James Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery, "on behalf of Private First Class David Mitchell, Corporal Miguel Rodriguez, Private First Class Tommy Chen, Sergeant William Patterson, Private First Class Stanley Kowalski, and Private Leo Morrison, I hereby report that all men are accounted for. The mission is complete. The promise is kept. You are relieved of duty, sir. Rest in peace." He saluted one final time, holding it as long as his trembling arm could manage. Then he carefully removed James's dog tag from the chain around his neck and dropped it into the grave, where it landed on the casket with a soft metallic clink. "Until we meet again, Captain," Leo whispered. After the burial, there was a reception at Rebecca's house. People shared stories and memories, ate sandwiches and drank coffee, did all the normal things people do when someone dies. But there was something different about this gathering, an awareness that they had witnessed something rare and profound, a promise kept across 74 years, a bond that death itself couldn't break. Leo sat in a comfortable chair in the living room, surrounded by the families of the 7. They shared stories and photographs, creating a living memorial to men who had been young together and had grown old apart, but had never truly been separated. Susan Mitchell showed pictures of her father at his steel mill, surrounded by co-workers who had become friends. Carlos Rodriguez shared stories his father had told about the free clinics, about patients who couldn't pay but were treated anyway. David Chen pulled up a video on his phone of his grandfather's restaurant, showing the line of customers that wrapped around the block every Sunday morning. "They lived good lives," Leo said, looking at the photographs and videos. "All of them. They came home and they lived. They had families and careers and joy. That's what the captain gave them. That's what he gave all of us, the chance to live." "And what did you do, Mr. Morrison?" Sarah asked her grandfather. "You've told me about the others, but you never talk about your own life after the war." Leo smiled. "I went home to Montana, took over the family ranch, married a wonderful woman named Elizabeth. She passed 12 years ago. We had 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and at last count, 14 great-grandchildren. I raised cattle and horses. I served on the school board for 20 years. I coached Little League Baseball. I lived a simple life, a good life, the kind of life that honors the men who didn't get to live at all." "And you stayed in touch with all of them?" Rebecca asked. "With all 6? "Everyone," Leo confirmed. "We didn't see each other often. Life gets in the way, you know. Jobs and families and distance. But we wrote letters. We made phone calls. And when one of us was dying, the others came, no matter what. That was the promise." "What happens now?" Michael asked quietly. "You're the last one. When your time comes, who will be there for you?" Leo looked at his granddaughter Sarah. "She will," he said simply. "I've told her everything. She knows the story. She knows the promise. And when I die, she'll make sure I'm buried with honor. And she'll make sure the 7 tags are interred together at Arlington like we planned. The circle will be closed. The promise will be complete." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'll be there, Grandpa. I promise." "I know you will, sweetheart," Leo said. "You're a Morrison. We keep our word." As the afternoon wore on and guests began to leave, Leo asked if he could spend a few minutes alone in James's study. Rebecca led him there, helping Sarah maneuver the wheelchair through the doorway. The study was exactly as James had left it. A desk covered with papers and books, a comfortable reading chair by the window, shelves lined with military history and biographies and novels, and on one wall, a single framed photograph that Rebecca had never paid much attention to before. It showed 7 young men in army uniforms, standing in the snow, their faces gaunt and exhausted, but their eyes alive with the fierce joy of survival. They had their arms around each other's shoulders, holding each other up, a unit in every sense of the word. Leo wheeled himself closer to the photograph, reaching out to touch the glass. "That was taken the day we got back to friendly lines," he said softly. "January 7th, 1951. We'd been given up for dead. Everyone thought we were gone. But the captain brought us through. He brought us home." He pointed to each face in the photograph, naming them: Mitchell, Rodriguez, Chen, Patterson, Kowalski, me, and the captain. His finger lingered on James's face, young and thin and marked by hardship, but undeniably alive. "Look at us. 23 went in, 7 came out, and we swore that day that we'd never forget the others, that we'd live for them, that we'd honor their sacrifice by being the best men we could be." "Did you?" Rebecca asked. "Did you honor them?" Leo turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw peace. "We tried," he said. "God knows we tried. We weren't perfect. We made mistakes. We had failures and regrets like everyone else. But we lived with intention. We loved our families. We served our communities. We kept our word. And when each of us faced death, we did it with dignity, knowing that our brothers were there. So, yes, I think we honored them. I think we honored the sacrifice of the 19 who didn't make it home. I think we lived lives worthy of the second chance we were given." Rebecca knelt beside the wheelchair, looking up at this ancient warrior who had traveled across the country one last time to keep a promise. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for being there for my father. Thank you for helping him let go. Thank you for telling us the truth about who he was." "It was my honor," Leo said simply. "Your father was the best man I ever knew, and I've known a lot of men." CTA Thunfro 3, inserted after emotional resolution. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. 3 months later, Rebecca received a phone call from Sarah Morrison. Leo had passed away peacefully in his sleep at his ranch in Montana, surrounded by family, his duty finally complete. The funeral would be held the following week, and Sarah wanted Rebecca and Michael to be there. They flew to Montana, to a small town nestled in the mountains where Leo had lived his entire life after the war. The funeral was large. Leo had been a pillar of his community for 7 decades, and it seemed like everyone in town had come to pay their respects. But after the public service, there was a private ceremony, just family and a few close friends. Sarah had arranged for a military honor guard, and they performed the ceremony with precision and dignity. As they folded the flag that had draped Leo's casket, Sarah stepped forward with a small wooden box. Inside were 7 dog tags on a single chain. "My grandfather made me promise," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her grief, "that when he died, I would take these tags to Arlington National Cemetery and have them interred in a special memorial plot he'd purchased, a place for the 7, so they could be together forever." She held up the chain, and the tags caught the light, each one bearing a name and a story and a promise kept. Mitchell, Rodriguez, Chen, Patterson, Kowalski, Morrison, Caldwell. These men made a promise 74 years ago. Sarah continued. They promised they'd never let each other die alone, and they kept that promise. Every single one of them. Through 7 decades, across thousands of miles, through all the changes and challenges of life, they kept their word. And now they'll rest together, as they always should have. 2 weeks later, on a cold November morning, a small group gathered at Arlington National Cemetery. Rebecca and Michael were there. Sarah Morrison was there. Representatives from the families of Mitchell, Rodriguez, Chen, Patterson, and Kowalski were there, and a handful of veterans from various wars, men and women who understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to keep faith with those who had stood beside you in the worst moments of your life. A simple marker had been placed in the ground. It read, "The 7 Korea, 1950. They kept the faith." Beneath the inscription were 7 names, listed in alphabetical order, each followed by their rank and the dates of their birth and death. Sarah stepped forward and carefully placed the wooden box containing the 7 dog tags into a small vault that had been prepared in the ground. As she did, she spoke the words her grandfather had taught her. Private First Class David Mitchell, Corporal Miguel Rodriguez, Private First Class Tommy Chen, Sergeant William Patterson, Private First Class Stanley Kowalski, Captain James Caldwell, Private Leo Morrison, all present and accounted for. The mission is complete. The circle is closed. Rest in peace, brothers. Your watch is over. The honor guard fired a salute. A bugler played taps. And 7 men who had made a promise in the frozen mountains of Korea finally came home together. Rebecca stood with her brother, watching the ceremony, and she felt something shift inside her. Not grief, though that was still there. Not sadness, though she would miss her father for the rest of her life. But something else. Something like pride and gratitude, and a profound sense of connection to something larger than herself. Her father had been a quiet man. He hadn't sought glory or recognition. He hadn't told dramatic stories or displayed his medals. He had simply lived with honor, kept his word, and carried his brothers with him until the very end. And in doing so, he had taught her the most important lesson of all, that the measure of a life isn't found in what you say or what you claim, but in what you do when no one is watching. In the promises you keep when keeping them costs you everything. In the quiet dignity of duty fulfilled and faith maintained. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Rebecca approached the marker one last time. She knelt down and placed her hand on the cold stone, feeling the engraved letters beneath her fingers. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "Thank you for showing me what it means to keep your word, what it means to honor those who came before, what it means to live a life worthy of the sacrifices others made. I understand now. I finally understand." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees that lined the cemetery paths. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of another funeral, another family saying goodbye to someone they loved. Life continued, as it always did, indifferent to individual grief, but somehow made meaningful by the connections we forge and the promises we keep. Rebecca stood and rejoined her brother. Together, they walked back through the cemetery, past row after row of white markers, each one representing a life lived and a duty fulfilled. And as they walked, Rebecca thought about the 7 young men who had stood together in the snow 74 years ago, who had made a promise that seemed impossible to keep, and who had kept it anyway. They had lived ordinary lives. They had worked ordinary jobs. They had faced ordinary challenges and celebrated ordinary joys. But in one way, in the way that mattered most, they had been extraordinary. They had kept faith with each other across 7 decades. They had honored their word when it would have been easy to forget. They had been there for each other in the moment that mattered most. And now they rested together, 7 brothers who had gone into the mountains as strangers and had come out as something more, something that transcended blood or nationality, or even life itself. They had become what every soldier hopes to become, a unit, a family, a promise kept. The last man had closed the circle. The count was complete. The watch was over. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead go when their duty is done, 7 young men stood together in the snow, their arms around each other's shoulders, holding each other up, finally and forever home.